The events of the Devil's Hour, the Time of Shadows, and the ongoing Void Aeon have devastated humanity's population. When once there were billions of people throughout the world, it has been deduced that the throng of humankind has been reduced drastically by 35%. This is even further decreased by the fact that as much as a third of the world's remaining humans have thrown their lot in with the many void cults that have sprung up globally, with many choosing to join the ranks of the monstrous Hexed, with countless millions struggling just to survive, let alone fighting off the influence of the gods of the void. Extraordinary men and women have risen up to defend their fellow man. These precious champions of the human species often choose to join one of five major factions that work to push back the darkness brought about by the void gods and those who willingly worship them. These factions are the nominally mercenary organization Steed, the remnants of the world's leading military in Goshawk, the affluent corporate alliance that is WASP, the alleged terrorist group BOA, and the massive socio-political institution called Chitin. While probably not the shiny heroes most people would expect, these five have withstood the tribulations of the Void Aeon in their efforts to safeguard humanity and its interests against the terrible entities that seek its destruction. We shall start with Steed. While its history is shrouded in mystery, and no one knows how long they have existed, there are many who agree that the organization began as a benevolent group of private military contractors in Africa, protectors of churches, mosques, holy sites, missionaries, pilgrims, relief workers, and undefended villages that needed armed assistance. Steed already had a stellar reputation among African nations. When the world went dark for 3 days from June 6 to June 8, 2006, and monstrous beings from another dimension came forth into our universe, Steed stood steadfast against them, bringing down countless horrors to a violent but decisive end. In the years that followed 2007 to 2008, Steed was hard at work at defending the peoples of Africa from the rapidly growing threat of voidists and the Hexed. While it took them a painfully long time to allow the tattered remains of African nations to rebuild and reorganize themselves, Steed paved the way for the formation of the Continental Group of the Nations of Africa and, subsequently, the Intercontinental Union. Steed's founding members were mostly of Catholic faith, but as of 2009, though some say as early as 2008, Steed began to recruit new members from non-Catholics of Africa, such as Protestants, Muslims, those with folk beliefs, and those who had no religion at all. Many believe that this move to recruit more diverse individuals was due to necessity, since the Hexed greatly outnumbered humans during that time. That said, there were others who believed that the sudden drive for inclusivity in Steed was more due to its members finding common ground with those they were protecting, and that more and more Africans wanted to become part of the group that kept them safe during the Time of Shadows and the subsequent Void Aeon. Steed, as of the year 2020, is led by Albrecht Welker, a veteran of several great battles against Void fanatics, the Hexed, and EEEs, or Eldritch Extra-Dimensional Entities. One of his most notable feats is that in the year of 2015, he and a small band of Steed agents managed to fight off a large group of Hex that were supported by the dreaded Whaler EEEs, who were intent on taking the coastal town of Battlemore. After the town was liberated and successfully defended from the cults dedicated to the void god Vlur, it became the unofficial base of operations of Steed, a hub of supplies, relief goods, and, most importantly, communication with allies and potential clients. Battlemore has now become a city of soldiers. Steed is widely believed to be a mercenary organization, as this is how they present themselves to the public. This is also emphasized by many news and documentary groups, especially those who are critical or outright hostile to Steed. They are often accused of being money-hungry hirelings who are only interested in making a profit off of the people they protect. However, as one testimonial has claimed, Steed might charge their clients in some way, but these are not always in the form of monetary or financial goods. More often than not, their payment has come in the form of food, clothing, or simple favors that benefit their organization and make them better able to defend the people they have taken a vow to watch over. In combat, Steed personnel prefer to use somewhat heavy but still mostly flexible powered armor in order to provide versatility for their troops. Their preference for vehicles remained the same, having moderately armored tanks, SABs or submersible amphibious boats, IFVs, and helicopters that allow them to move faster than would be otherwise possible with their size and durability. That said, less armor means greater vulnerability, as is the case with their scouts, artillery, and ACVs. Their preference for vehicles remained the same, having moderately armored tanks, SABs or submersible amphibious boats, IFVs, and helicopters that allow them to move faster than would be otherwise possible with their size and durability. That said, less armor means greater vulnerability, as is the case with their scouts, artillery, and ACVs. They also make use of specialized morale-boosting personnel, like their monastic squads. The personnel of Steed would also like to insist that they're not the resurrected orders of the Knights Templar. They swear. Next, we have the large peacekeeping force known as Goshawk. A known stalwart defender of the common man, Goshawk mainly works with the Intercontinental Union or ICU in their effort to promote stability and growth in many countries of the world. Due to the terror and destruction caused by the Void Aeon and sporadic attacks from Void fanatics, Goshawk is well aware how difficult it is to maintain, let alone rebuild the struggling and sometimes utterly devastated communities of the world. Based mainly in Canada, Goshawk is composed mostly of Canadian, American, Mexican, British, German, French, Dutch, Italian, Australian, and New Zealander military personnel. Goshawk was immediately formed in the years after the Devil's Hour and the Time of Shadows, desperately trying to protect and revive the United Nations even as the latter started collapsing. After the demise of the UN and its constituents descending into chaos, Goshawk did its best to save what was left of it and establish a new order that they dearly hoped would hold authority over the now mostly shattered nations of the world and return some semblance of sanity and safety to its people. It was around July 12, 2006 that the militaries of Canada, the USA, and Mexico decided to engage in open communication with one another and establish an organized effort to bring back law and order in the chaotic cities and towns of North America. While nothing official had been formed or formulated then, those fateful times when all Canadian, American, and Mexican soldiers had was each other that they came to realize not just their similarities but also their potential as allies. As of the moment, Goshawk is led by Queen Joanne of Quebec, Canada's first officially crowned queen. That said, while she may be distantly related to Great Britain's newly crowned king, Edwin Ed Hurley, they have chosen to work as separate monarchs, though they have stated that they want to work closely together for the good of all. She has spearheaded Goshawk and the many nations that comprise it in the effort to drive back the forces of the Void and return the world to a more peaceful and safe place. One of her most famous acts was the reclamation of Alaska, wherein she and a select number of her most trusted soldiers liberated several cities in the state that were occupied by Void fanatics and EEEs, a feat that truly astounded the world as, at the time at least, Alaska was long thought to be lost to the Void. Goshawk remains to be one of, if not the most steadfast defenders of humanity against the forces of the Void, although it has earned more than its fair share of critics over the years. One of these, of course, is the international media broadcasting group Syncretic International Network, or SIN, which postulates that Goshawk is nothing more than the ICU's, or Intercontinental Union's, thugs that cows its enemies and dissidents into submission. This isn't even taking into account the many Void sympathizers who see the efforts of the group as too extreme and violent, even though, all things considered, Goshawk is just trying to do what it can to protect people from the gods of the Void, the Hexed, and those who choose to throw in their lot with them. It just so happens, though, that compared to all the other factions fighting the Void and those who serve it, Goshawk is probably the most overt and thorough of them. Only Steed approaches the kind of response Goshawk resorts to in its many encounters with the enemy. In its clashes with the enemies of humanity, Goshawk prefers to make use of the heaviest and most devastating weapons that it can. These include their truly lethal arrow rifles that shoot explosive bullets, and their heavy, powered armor that keeps them protected from most conventional weaponry. They also tend to field the heaviest tanks, artillery, IFVs, and even aircraft, granting them superiority over most other forces of the enemy. That said, they are unfortunately encumbered by the weight of their arsenal in both bulk and cost. Indeed, though they are a potent force against the forces of the Void, Goshawk is probably the slowest to react, as not only is their arsenal costly, they are also sluggish thanks to their cumbersome weight. Goshawk is also quite charitable in providing relief goods and other humanitarian aid, and is famous, or rather infamous, for giving war orphans tons upon tons of chocolate bars when they visit. While feared and hated by most, including and especially the ICU, the alleged terrorist organization known as BOA ranks amongst the most notable protectors of humanity. Often acting from the shadows, BOA is a secretive organization with members all over the world, ready to strike at and crush any force that would endanger humanity, including and especially those aligned with the Void. They are notable for being cunning and swift, nipping the growth of their enemies at the bud and preventing them from becoming a true danger to the world at large. While spread throughout the world, BOA mostly draws members from Brazil, Russia, the remnants of China, Egypt, as well as many other Eastern European countries like Belarus, Romania, Hungary, and a few nations in the Indian Ocean like Sri Lanka and Madagascar. It was believed that BOA existed even before the Devil's Hour and the Time of Shadows, and was once just a network of hackers all over the world. It is even rumored, but not proven, that they were instrumental in providing video surveillance evidence of the atrocities committed by Marcello Magno and the Platinum Church to the general public, causing them to fall in popularity. This was what would eventually cause Reverend Magno to commit violent atrocities against the children of the Philippines, and eventually the Devil's Hour, wherein 666,666 children were forcibly taken, and majority of them being sacrificed in an act of brutal savagery in order to make way for the gods of the Void. Whatever the case, BOA remains to be one of the most bitter enemies of the Void, who will attack them whenever and wherever possible. What often makes things so horrific is that, more often than not, the strongholds of the Void are often found at the heart of civilian population centers. BOA is led by the mysterious and enigmatic figure known only as Boss BOA, a man often clad in black and red with a visored helmet. He is easily identified by his raspy voice, strange demeanor, and a tendency to dance the samba in inopportune moments, with many commenting or assuming that he is, in fact, a madman. Despite this, he, as well as most of BOA, have a considerable following, with many supporters across the globe. Two of the most noteworthy events surrounding him were the attacks on Suffering Hospital in the rural areas of Alabama in the United States, and Sleazy Orphanage near Birmingham in the United Kingdom. At first, the world was horrified and outraged by these acts of alleged terrorism until the awful truth came to light. It became known to the public after a thorough investigation that Suffering Hospital was involved in illegal and unethical human experiments during its time of operation, and its head, Dr. Reginald Serrano, was a cultist of Zorl, the void god of water. As for the sleazy orphanage, it was discovered to be involved in child trafficking and secretly sold orphans as child sacrifices for void cultists, which were all overseen by Mrs. Leela Marrow, a devotee of Yug, void goddess of earth. This was further proven by testimonies from victims of both Suffering Hospital and Sleazy Orphanage who saw the members of BOA as heroes and saviors rather than terrorists. BOA faces many enemies other than the gods of the void, such as the WPN or World Police Network, who still see them as terrorists despite their actions to the contrary. That said, as already mentioned, BOA continues to swell in its ranks as more and more people are realizing what terrible danger the void presents to the world, and that more people need to take up arms against it in order for there to be any hope of actual victory for mankind. Still, in many places where ignorance is the norm, BOA and its constituents are seen as dangerous insurgents, even though their members are best described as vigilantes, anarchists, vandals, trolls, and pranksters. They are often actively hunted and hated by the authorities, and the ICU continues to expand their threat to society at large and must obligate or hire organizations like Goshawk or Steed to constantly search for them or apprehend them when possible. As befits their symbol, BOA often relies on stealth, subterfuge, and sabotage to fight their enemies. They have mastered the use of active camouflage, which is best described as a form of invisibility, and many of their vehicles and war machines have the ability to avoid detection, be it radar, sonar, or thermal sensors. Another of BOA's more insidious tactics is their ability to hack the systems of vehicles and fortifications, either fooling them completely, or worse, taking control of them and turning them against their enemies. BOA is also more willing to resort to biological and chemical warfare against void cultists using gas, germs, and toxins that can effectively incapacitate, subvert, or outright destroy their foes. BOA also vehemently denies that the person who was seen dancing on the streets of Calcutta, India that looked like Boss BOA was not the actual Boss BOA. Perhaps the most thorough and ruthless of the forces fighting against the forces of the void is Chitin, an international institute dedicated to better understanding and combating the void and those who choose to side with it. Centered in Scandinavia, Chitin is best described as an organization that is focused on discovering the true nature of the gods of the void and eradicating them for good. Using the most advanced research techniques and application of cutting-edge technology, few forces in the Void Aeon can match the potential firepower and complete destruction of enemies that Chitin can offer. Supported by the nations of Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, Poland, Belgium, and Austria in Europe, India, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Korea in Asia, and Argentina and Chile in South America, Chitin takes an offensive stance against the Hexed and the forces of the Void, seeking to ensure that the world or anyone else will never have to worry about them ever again. Chitin began as a simple group of scientists, teachers, researchers, and professors who sought to understand the time of shadows and what brought it about. When the time of shadows ended and the light of the sun once again touched the earth and its peoples, Chitin grew into a larger organization as more and more people became interested in learning more about the void and how it can be effectively combated. As time wore on and 2000 made way for the following years until 2010, Chitin became even larger, attracting adherents from all over the world who sought to solve the troubles brought about by the void. Now, Chitin has grown to a truly large organization and has been hard at work in finding new and more efficient ways to banish or destroy the EEEs commanded by the forces of the void. The leader of Chitin is designated by the organization as the High Dean, and the current one would be Imogen Goddesson, the so-called Shining Valkyrie, infamous for crafting for herself a harness that allows her to fly and rain death upon the foes of mankind. That said, she is also known for her gentler nature and was instrumental in providing relief aid for the victims of the violence and destruction brought about by the enemies of humanity. She was involved in the cleansing of New Delhi, where she and a still fledgling Chitin struggled to help the Indian military dislodge the strongholds of Hak and Quish that had already been established in the area. While the fighting was fierce and many lost their lives, it was still considered a great victory for mankind as the void cultists were routed, with the vast majority of them meeting their demise and those that remained fled to parts unknown. Chitin also has a fair number of opponents, most of whom criticize the organization's methods of fighting the enemies of humanity. Many of these critics postulate that even attempting to understand the forces of the void is dangerous and could lead to one joining them. Despite this, however, Chitin continues their study of the Great Foe, believing that their knowledge of the gods of the void can unlock the secret to truly defeating them once and for all. It is often stated by members of Chitin that by choosing to remain ignorant of the enemy and its true nature will only lead to the foes becoming even stronger and allowing them to gain the upper hand against humanity. To better fight the forces of the void, Chitin makes use of advanced technology and a lot of firepower to win the day. Utilizing laser, sonic, and cryogenic weapons, there are only a precious few enemies they aren't ready for. Their lasers are highly effective against well-armored opponents, often penetrating even the heaviest or densest of armors and causing additional damage in the process. Their use of sonic weapons allowed them to make quick work of most fortifications, reducing them to rubble in a matter of moments. Meanwhile, their cryogenic arsenal gives them the ability to freeze the opponents in place and make it difficult for still living enemies like fanatics to move or call upon the power of the void gods. Unfortunately, while certainly strong and difficult to defeat, the forces of Chitin often have very poor armor and are easily destroyed when the tides of war turn against them. That is why most field commanders of Chitin prefer speed over staying power, and most of their vehicles are notable in that they can easily outrun most of their counterparts in other factions. For those who fight beneath the banner of Chitin, getting the first shot in is often more important than having the protection to withstand an incoming enemy counterattack, since if the foe is defeated already, one will not have to worry about the retaliation after all. Chitin is also noteworthy for causing quite a ruckus in Anjou, France, when they accidentally used an experimental weapon that resulted in people's clothes dissolving. Rising as one of the greatest foes of the void is the organization known as WASP, which began in the Middle East. Composed mostly of Arab countries, WASP relies heavily on mechanized and/or robotic war machines to win the day. While not as well armed or well protected as the other forces that fight for the survival and safety of mankind, WASP is nonetheless more than able to make up for this by being able to summon almost innumerable mechanical troops to bolster its ranks in combat. Supported by the majority of the Middle East such as Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Libya, Sudan, the United Arab Emirates, Yemen, Oman, Palestine, and, surprising to some, Israel, with Indonesia, Brunei, and Mongolia as its allies in Asia, and Greece, Albania, Spain, and Portugal in Europe, WASP seeks to overwhelm the foes of humanity with its innumerable instruments of war. As mentioned, Wasp began in the Middle East and got its start as a small but successful toy company in Turkey. During the time of Shadows, when much of the world was plunged into darkness for 3 straight days, the owners and employees of the company discovered that their remote-controlled toys were surprisingly useful. For one thing, they were able to provide light. Second, they could distract the numerous eldritch extra-dimensional entities or EEEs that emerged from the dark to attack and abduct people and get them to pursue the toys instead, and, of course, provided entertainment and a sense of hope to those in hiding at the time. At the end of the time of Shadows, these same toy manufacturers thought to put weapons on said toys, and were thus able to effectively counter the invading EEEs without having to put people at risk. Better yet, most of the weaponized toys could be easily repaired or replaced, providing the fledgling organization with an almost unlimited number of troops. Today, WASP continues its campaign against the Void with great fervor, with onlookers looking upon the remote-controlled soldiers and war machines with awe and wonder. As of now, WASP is now being led by Mr. Hakan Kundakci, the son of Hamza Kundakci, founder and owner of Kundakci Toys. WASP wasn't always centered on war, and even today, they are more concerned with repelling and or destroying EEEs than they are at actually harming people. Hakan, much like his father Hamza, prioritizes the safety and welfare of children and decided to weaponize his remote-controlled toys as he discovered that they could effectively draw EEEs away from potential victims and attack them with some degree of success. Hakan Kundakci gained considerable fame and renown when he and a few of his employees were able to save Jerusalem and possibly most of Israel from cultists dedicated to Blur. While most of his weaponized toys were destroyed in the fight for the Holy Land, he won with minimal human casualties and managed to keep most of the people in the city safe until the battle ended. This resulted in him becoming the most respected man in the Levant, earning him the title, the man who saved the Middle East. WASP is also beset by adversaries, even though they are respected in many places of the world. These are mostly critics of their method of warfare, and people who do not fully understand their dream and vision. Others are simply bigots who have a negative view of Middle Easterners and those associated with them through religion, even though they have proven themselves time and again as friends to all children and enemy of all who would threaten mankind. While it disappoints members of WASP to hear this, many of them are still willing to risk all to keep the world's children safe from the monsters of the Void. As already mentioned, WASP often prefers to use remote-controlled weapons platforms to overwhelm the enemy with their sheer numbers. That said, they do still have conventional human troops, and quite a few of them in fact, drawn from all over the Levant and Southeast Asia. However, it just so happens that using mechanical troops tends to be more cost-effective, and not to mention safer than using actual people in the war against the foes of humanity. What makes this all even better is that, being non-living beings, mechanical troops and unmanned vehicles are almost totally immune to the parapsychological effects of the Void. Besides, even when damaged, these machines of war can be easily repaired and, even if not, they can be replaced quickly by a newly built one. In actual combat, one can expect WASP to field a near innumerable amount of robotic soldiers, unmanned tanks, and remote-controlled war machines. The human soldiers only show up to clean up the mess that's left behind. That said, one of the key weaknesses of WASP is that its robotic war machines aren't exactly that durable, and are all too often easily destroyed when not supported properly. While potent, its human troops become quite vulnerable without remote-controlled war machines to protect them. Lastly, Hakan Kundakci hides a well-guarded secret. He is addicted to coffee, and without it, he will become devoured and useless.